I want to set your palate a little bit. Find yourselves what you feel appropriate. We call that levies, if you didn't know, in the township world. But to set your mind right, first I want to talk a little bit about size so you understand what's going on in Clay County. So my question for you is, let's say within 20,000 acres-ish or so, how big is Clay County? Maybe I'll give you some options. Let's say, is it 200,000 acres? Is it 200 to 250? Is it 250 to 300? Is it 300,000 to 350,000 acres for the county? Anybody? Fire away. Okay. It is between 250 and 300. It is 267,000-ish acres is the entire county, okay? How many acres, and this number might be a little wrong, town's been expanding, how many acres does the city of Vermillion cover? Is it, well, let's say 2,000 to 2,500? Is it 2,500 to 3,000? Is it more than 3,000? So the last number I have is 2,980 acres. Okay? So, all right. What cities reside all or part in Clay County? How many? Let's just do that. Let's take incorporated or not? Incorporated. So this is a much bigger voice of politicalness than me. I think incorporated is my answer. My answer says 4, and this is where the question can say if I'm right or not. Vermillion, Wakanda, Meckling, and Burbank. Is it partially in Clay County? See, it's even more than that. Look at how big our county is. Okay, this one I feel confident in. How many school districts? How many school districts are in Clay County?
3, 4.
All or part? All or part? My answer I have here is 6, and you can vet me on this. Vermillion, Beersford, Centerville, Irene, Wakanda, Gayville, Vollen, Viborg, Hurley, all branch into Clay County.
Alcester?
I don't think Alcester comes that far, does it? It'd have to cross the interstate for their school district. Okay. My kids would go to Beersford, and I'm in Clay County. Okay. Number of townships. How many townships? Here we get into the fun. How many townships make up the county of Clay County?
9.
Higher than 9. 12. Bonus points if anybody can name them all. Where's Travis Mockler? He crushed it when I made him do that last time. Hey, if you didn't know, the 12 are Bethel, Fairview, Garfield. That's where I'm the clerk. Best one. Glenview, Meckling, Norway, Pleasant Valley, Prairie Center, Riverside, Spirit Mount, Star, and Vermillion. You live in one of those townships if you did not know that. How many elected officials does your township have, or could your township have? Let's say number of rolls.
4.
There could be 4 elected rolls that are year-round rolls. They're a clerk, a treasurer, supervisor, and there's 3 of those usually, and a constable. Each township could elect their own constable if they so chose. Who knew? Okay, another fun one. Think township, okay? Think township. What do you suppose, at least in my township, but I think is accurate in most townships, are the largest single annual expenses for a township? What about roads? Gravel. The single thing we spend our most money on is gravel. And that has now expanded to small structures. If you want a master's class in small structures, I can't do it, but I can get you close. It's under 20 feet between the abutments and less than 12 feet tall, I think, something to that effect. Okay, and the last few things, and these are written into law. What are the things that have to happen? There are 6 things that have to happen, at your normal annual township meeting, which we have, oh no, that's going to be a bonus question. What are 6 things that have to happen? Can anybody just start rattling them off? Give me any. So budget, and that's levy taxes. We have to come up with what levies we're going to have for our township. Equalization. No, that's not this meeting. That meeting's on March 17th for everybody. That's the week of March 17th. Elect people. Every year you have to elect your clerk, your treasurer, and at least one of your supervisors. Any other guesses?
You have to approve minutes.
Okay, now we're getting into the weeds here. All right, you have to actually approve an insurance carrier. You have to designate your legal newspaper. You have to review your plantings for weed control. And weed is actually anything that grows in the ditch that's not supposed to be in the ditch. So even trees count as weeds if they're in the ditch inappropriately. And then your road maintenance plan and efforts. Bonus question, when are township annual meetings, when is the annual meeting that's community available scheduled? If you get the Star or the Plain Talk or the Broadcaster, you have seen it in the advertisements for the last 2 weeks. Close. Tuesday, first Tuesday in March. So if you're bored and want to drive around and pick up a Coke from me at the Dalesburg Lutheran Church, 1:30 on Tuesday, the 3rd? 4th? I bet I'll make it there. That's when our annual meeting is. Okay, equalization, that's different. We don't set your taxes. We just try to agree with you that you got overassessed. Anyway, any other questions? Okay, thank you everybody.
All right, so please welcome our speaker today, Rotarian Art Rusch, who's going to talk about the death penalty in South Dakota.
Mike Card asked me to talk about the death penalty. I presume because I'm the only person in Vermillion and the only person in the South Dakota legislature who has personally sentenced a person to death. That was Donald Moeller in 1997. And I spent 6 weeks trying the Moeller case in Rapid City and a year preparing for that case. And part of my preparation involved familiarizing myself with the death penalty cases in South Dakota. Anybody who's involved in a death penalty case will tell you death is different. It's different than anything else. And the United States Supreme Court said the penalty of death differs from all other forms of criminal punishment, not in degree, but in kind. It is unique in its total irrevocability. It is unique in its rejection of rehabilitation of the convict as a basic purpose of criminal justice. And it is unique, finally, in its absolute renunciation of all that is embodied in our concept of humanity. South Dakota, as I said, has had 20 death penalty cases. That's nothing compared to what some of the states have. Just an example, Virginia has had nearly 1,400 executions in their history. Texas, 1,300, and going down to California, over 700. Most of them are less than that. So by 20 in South Dakota is not very many. But it's concerning to me that a large portion of those have taken place in the recent past. It's not, people say, oh, I don't remember any death penalty cases in South Dakota. They must have been a long time ago. In fact, a lot of them have taken place very recently. Of the 20 executions here in South Dakota, 1 was carried out by Dakota Territory, 6 were carried out by the federal government, and 13 of those were carried out by the state of South Dakota. But 25% of those were in the past dozen years. The first person here to talk about is, and this is not Jack McCall, this is Wild Bill Hickok. This is his victim. But Jack McCall was the first execution in South Dakota. Everybody knows about Jack McCall and Wild Bill Hickok from Deadwood, but that isn't where the trial actually took place. What happened is after Jack McCall killed Wild Bill Hickok, they didn't have any court system set out there, so they kind of selected a citizens jury, and he told the jury about how he killed Wild Bill Hickok because Wild Bill Hickok had killed his brother. And the jury said, oh, well, okay, then you go on your way. So Jack McCall went down to Cheyenne, and in Cheyenne, of course, he was bragging in the bar about how he was the person who had killed the gunman, Wild Bill Hickok, and how the jurors up in Deadwood had let him go because he told them about Wild Bill Hickok killing his brother, and he didn't actually even have a brother. Unfortunately for him, the guy who was drinking at the bar next to him was a deputy U.S. Marshal who arrested him and brought him to Yankton, which was the capital and where they actually had a court system, and he was tried in Yankton and sentenced to death in Yankton. And one of the issues he raised in his appeal was the fact that he had, that was double jeopardy because he had already been tried out in Deadwood, but the Supreme Court on his appeal said that doesn't count, that was an illegal jury anyway, so you haven't had double jeopardy. So he was hung at Yankton out what was the school section of land at that time, which was outside of town. It's actually where the state hospital or the Human Services Center on that property now. There used to be a historic marker there designating that. I'm not sure whether that's still there. The second, that was 1877. So then the next execution was Thomas Egan. He was executed in Sioux Falls on 1882. He is the one person that we know was innocent that was executed. How they even came up with a theory that he was guilty, I don't know. He was an immigrant from Ireland. He had married a widow in Wisconsin, and they moved out to Minnehaha County. And she had a daughter from her first marriage, and they had 3 more children on their marriage. And they were having some marital difficulties, and she went into Sioux Falls to see a lawyer about a divorce. And he went with the 3 boys over to McCook County. They had some hay ground over there, and they went over and they spent a couple of days haying over in McCook County. And then he came back and went in the house and came out and said that his wife was dead, was in the basement and was dead. So her daughter from her earlier marriage and her husband were very insistent that he had killed his wife, and obviously domestic violence was an issue back then as it is now. So they arrested him. He was held in the Minnehaha County Jail for 22 months before this was finally disposed of. He was convicted, and I don't have any idea what the theory was that they had on that. The theory was that he had killed her before they went over to McCook County, and that she'd laid there all these days, and then nobody had discovered her. Was the theory that he had come back from McCook County and gone in the house and murdered her, and then came out immediately and told his boys. I don't know what the theory was, but anyway, the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. The execution was botched. The first time they put him up on the scaffold, and they used an old rope, and the first time they dropped him on the trapdoor, the rope broke, and so he fell down. So they brought him back up on the scaffold, and while they were in the process of putting a new rope around his neck, somebody accidentally tripped the trapdoor again, and he fell again, but because the rope wasn't on, it wasn't successful, and so they brought him back up, and on the third time he was hung. The people I've read think probably it was anti-immigrant hysteria that was probably very prevalent at that time, and that probably had a lot to do with his execution. In 1927, which obviously was way too late to do him any good, his stepdaughter admitted that she was the one who'd killed her mother and that he'd had nothing to do with it at all. And the state of South Dakota has formally apologized to Thomas Egan for executing him wrongfully, but what good does that do after you're executed? Brave Bear was Sitting Bull's son-in-law, and he was accused of committing several murders. He went with Sitting Bull to Canada, and while Sitting Bull was in Canada, when they came back from Canada, I'm not sure why he came back, why he didn't stay in Canada, but when he came back, he was arrested and brought to Yankton, where he was tried again and was executed in Yankton in 1882. That execution took place in Yankton, right behind, in the alley behind the old courthouse. Not the old courthouse that most of you remember, but the old courthouse that fell down last summer, and which was right next to school where I went to grade school, and there was a historic marker there marking that when I was a kid that I always thought was interesting to read, but that's disappeared since then too. Then there were two more executions, one in 1882 and 1892. James Gilmore was executed in Deadwood, and a peculiar thing, he was on a wagon train with another guy, and when they stopped for the night, he went over and killed one of the other people that was with him. And I never heard any real explanation other than that he probably mentally ill. In 1992, James Lehman was executed in Custer, and the county marshal came out to serve an arrest warrant on him, and he killed the marshal, and that was what he was arrested for. To go back to the mentally ill, the issue about whether people are mentally ill is still a big issue. Up in Lincoln County right now, they have a person who has been determined to have an IQ of 60, and the judge there in the state wants to execute this person. The judge ruled that the person was of a mental capability that they couldn't execute this person, and the state is appealing that now, so they're waiting for a decision from the Supreme Court about whether they'll execute somebody with an IQ of 60. Anyway, Gilmore, or Layton and Lehman, then Nathaniel Thompson the following year in DeSmet. And this was they had the domestic violence back then. His wife left him. He went in with a butcher knife that he had sharpened to persuade her to come home. And she was staying with a friend. So when he attacked his wife with a butcher knife, her corset deflected the knife. People don't have that kind of protection anymore, I don't think. But anyway, so the friend that she was staying with stepped in the way there, and so he stabbed the friend to death. So he was executed in DeSmet in 1893. In 1894, J. Hicks was executed in Sturgis. And again, kind of an example of the uneven justice that occurs. There were 3 people participated in the killing at that time. J. Hicks was the only one that was executed. One of the others was given a lenient sentence of 10 years because he turned state's evidence and testified against J. Hicks. And J. Hicks's brother, who was still a minor, was not executed. So of the 3 people that were involved in the murder, only one of them was actually executed. Chief Two Sticks is another person. I would pronounce the Indian name, except I can't pronounce it. But he may have been actually innocent. We've found that across the country. A lot of people have been exonerated after they were sentenced. And A lot of that is because of plea agreements that were made. Chief Two Sticks, the people who actually did the murder in that case, were given lenient sentences of 5 years in return for testifying against Chief Two Sticks. Whether he was actually involved, whether their testimony was true, whether they were just saving their life by testifying against him. It's hard to tell. No appeal was taken, so we have no record of exactly what the record was in that case. But he was executed in Deadwood in 1894. The last thing he said is that, I've killed lots of Indians, but I've never killed a white man. So this is unfair that I'm being executed. I don't think the theory was that he had actually killed the people in that case. I think the theory was that he had encouraged people. So maybe what he was saying was true, maybe it wasn't true. Who can tell at this time? Isidore Kavanaugh was the first black person executed in Dakota Territory. No appeal was taken, so again, we don't have any kind of a record about what that. He was executed at Deadwood on July 14th of 1897, just a few months after he was arrested. The story is that he had worked in this cafe. He got fired from the cafe, and then he went gambling, and by the end of the day, or the end of the evening, he was drunk and broke, and he tried to remedy that by going back and burglarizing the cafe where he had worked before. And when the owner found him, he killed not only the person but her dog. Ernest Loveswar killed 2 men. No appeal was taken, so we don't really know what the record was. He was executed in Sturgis in 1902, so that would have been the state executed. Alan Walkingshield was another case of domestic violence. He was in love with this girl and went to the house late at night and killed the girl he was in love with and her mother. George Bear was a bizarre case. His wife owned some hay ground on the reservation, and he found out that his son-in-law, his wife's son, was selling some of the hay from his hay ground. So he went to the schoolhouse where the farm assistant for the reservation was teaching and asked the farm assistant what he should do, and the farm assistant said, well, you should try to work it out with your son-in-law. And so he went and killed his son-in-law and came back and killed the farm assistant. And then went to Bone Steel and was going to kill the guy who'd bought the hay, but that was the next day, and so they were alert for that and arrested him before he could do that. Emil Victor was another Aberdeen. He worked at an elevator there. One of the buyers for the elevator was James Christie, I think. Anyway, Emil Victor talked to everybody about how Christie had all this money and it would be certainly easy to rob him. And everybody in the elevator knew from his talking that he intended to rob the Christies. So he went out to the Christie farm, then slept in the in the barn overnight. And when Mr. Christie came out in the morning to do chores, he killed Mr. Christie with a hammer. And then the neighbor boy who was also doing chores there, he shot and killed him. Mrs. Christie heard the gunfire from the barn, and so she came out of the house, and he shot and killed her, and then went in the house looking for money, and their 17-year-old daughter was in the house, and he killed her. He was, again, no appeal was taken. He was hung very shortly after that. George Rickman was the second black person executed in South Dakota. Again, this was a domestic violence case where he was in love with her neighbor and her 14-year-old daughter, and wanted to marry her. He went and killed both of them and set the house on fire. And again, no appeal was taken. He was executed at Bison in 1913. All of those people were executed by hanging, but then from 1913 until 1939, there was no death penalty in South Dakota. In 1939, when they reinstated the death penalty, they said it's going to be done with the electric chair. Only South Dakota didn't have an electric chair. So my understanding is they borrowed Illinois' electric chair and had the people in the workshops at the penitentiary build this electric chair for them, and that's on display in the museum in Pierre. But this was only used once, and that was for George Sitz, and that was 1947. So from when they reinstated the death penalty, it was a number of years before they actually used that. George Sitz had escaped from jail in Minneapolis with several other people, and he headed west. And interesting differences in law enforcement. They didn't have the radio then, but they had telephones, and I think they called all over. And so when he got to Belle Fourche, he went into a gas station to buy gas in Belle Fourche. And apparently this had been publicized so well that the attendant in the gas station figured out right away who he was. And so as soon as he got his fill of gas and left, the attendant in the gas station called the sheriff. And so the sheriff and a DCI agent who lived there went down south of Belle Fourche to the highway that goes over to Wyoming and followed him for a ways and got him stopped. And the sheriff had stayed back at the intersection. So the DCI agent got him stopped and told him to turn around and go back to the intersection. So he did, and once he got back there where the sheriff and the DCI agent were, he killed both of them. He then snuck into somebody's house in Spearfish, and he stayed in the basement of their house for 2 weeks, and they were unknown that he was in the house there. And finally, I suppose he was getting hungry. I don't know whether there was food available or not. Finally, he left and was captured in Wyoming. He was executed in 1947. But his last words were, and I think it's very apropos, that this is the first time the cops helped me escape from jail. And you'll see as we get to a lot of these that a lot of the people who were executed in South Dakota basically wanted to be executed because they thought that was their way of getting away from jail. So after that 1947, and that was the only electric chair execution in South Dakota. So there were no further executions for 70 years. Until 2000, 3 young men killed a friend in Spearfish so that they could rob his home because his parents were gone, and brutal. And I don't want to tell you that any of these were not brutal events, but so they killed his friend in Spearfish so they could rob his home. Appeals are now required, so all of these cases had appeals taken. But Elijah Page was executed in 2007, and that's because he refused to have any, other than the bare minimum of appeals, he refused to have any appeals taken because he wanted to die. So he was executed in 2007. The jury heard Darrell Hoadley's case and decided that Hoadley should not be executed, and Briley Piper, the third one, is still on death row today, and that's 25 years later. The murder of Ronald Johnson. In 2011, 2 inmates at the South Dakota Penitentiary decided to escape, so Eric Robert and Rodney Burgett killed the guard Ronald Johnson and took his uniform, and they were caught before they could leave the penitentiary. Eric Robert pled guilty and tried to prevent any appeals because he wanted to be executed right away. the South Dakota Supreme Court said appeals are mandatory in South Dakota, so they considered the appeal and upheld his death sentence. So he was executed in 2012, so that was just a year afterwards. Burgett also pled guilty, but took a few appeals, but ultimately the Supreme Court upheld his death sentence as well, and he was executed in 2018. So, you know, a lot of our death penalty cases arise from those two incidents. Charles Russell Rhines, in 1992, Rhines burglarized a donut shop in Rapid City where he formerly worked. During the burglary, he killed an employee. In January of 1993, Rhines was convicted of the murder and sentenced to death. Over the next 25 years, Rhines filed multiple lawsuits and appeals, but ultimately lost them, and he was finally executed in 2019. So that's 27 years after the offense, after the murder took place. We've had two people who committed suicide on death row. Robert Leroy Anderson committed suicide in 2003. James Vernon McKay committed suicide in 2014. And I know each time that the death penalty has come up in front of the legislature, the Attorney General's office is there arguing that the polling shows people in South Dakota favor the death penalty. And I guess that's what the polling shows. But in fact, when it comes down to deciding whether somebody should die or not, juries aren't so clear. So there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cases during this period of time when the juries have refused to impose the death penalty. And each of those are cases where the state went through all the expense, because death penalty cases are very, very expensive with the legal and the experts and the length of time and the juries. But in 8 of these cases where the jury were given an opportunity and they refused to impose. We have one local case, which was a death penalty case. Thomas Whitehawk killed James Yeato in Vermillion in 1967. He pled guilty without any kind of a plea agreement to avoid a death sentence. So he was sentenced to death, but in 1969, Governor Frank Farrar commuted that to a life sentence. And in 1997, Whitehawk died in the South Dakota State Penitentiary of natural causes on that. Some people believe that that was one of the factors that cost Frank Farrar that election that year, that he was defeated by Knipe that time because of people who were upset over the fact that Farrar had commuted Whitehawk's sentence. So I have a lot of concerns about the death penalty. One is the hardship on the people that are involved. The trial that I had, I had jurors who had psychological problems as a result of what they had to go through on that. On the cost, like I say, the costs are huge on all of those. Question about whether they're really deterrent or not. Betty has testified that the research shows that there isn't a deterrent to that. I know former Attorney General Mark Meyer Henry and former Attorney General Roger Tellinghusen both testified at various times that there's no deterrent effect. There clearly isn't. One of the people who was executed, his brother had been executed a few years earlier in Missouri for a murder, so clearly that didn't have any deterrent effect on him. And you know, I never, as a state's attorney, I never tried any death penalty cases here in Clay County, but certainly in my experience in doing 20,000 criminal cases, that the possibility of punishment has very little deterrent effect on people because most of them don't think they're going to get caught. So, you know, anyway, that's, like I said, people think we are not aware of the fact how many death penalty cases we had in South Dakota, and are particularly not aware of how many we've had in the recent past on this case. So anyway, now you know about the death penalty case. I tried to write this up and get it published by the South Dakota Historical Society in their journal, and they didn't want to because they thought it was so gruesome. So I'm happy to see that all of you stuck it out here. Anyway, so thank you.
All right, thank you for that. So Art, I have a question. In the Egan case, did the daughter ever say why she killed her mother? Did the daughter say why she had killed her mother?
Which one?
Was it Egan? Egan, yeah. When she said she'd killed her mother, did she say why?
I think she had an argument with her mother.
Okay. All right.
She was on her deathbed, so there were no consequences.
Right, yeah. Okay. All right, thanks, that was very interesting. All right, so do the 50-50 here. One of our guests. Yeah. All right, have to be here to win. All right, so thanks to our guests, Kylie, Katie, Raina, Miles, Corey, and Wade. A few of you have left, it looks like, but hope to see you all back here again sometime. And yeah, I guess we'll go on with our Pledge of Allegiance here. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God,